Good Friday is a reminder that Jesus chose to die. He chose to die so that anyone who just believes in just a little bit might live forever. When I think about that, I'm going to take a moment this day to just sit quietly, maybe go for a walk, and just remember how much I'm loved. And my prayer for you on this Good Friday is that you would remember that ultimately Jesus chose to die because he had you in mind, that he utterly, utterly loves you, that you are far more loved than you could ever dream or ever imagine. Hey, Pastor Rick here, and I hope you're having a good Easter weekend. And I just want to take a few minutes and give you some devotional thoughts from a little resource I've been using by a guy by the name of John Ortberg, a pastor out in San Francisco, when it comes to Good Friday. And so I hope this can be a blessing to you. I know that oftentimes it's so busy during this time of the year and this week, but maybe this can be a small meditation to help you in many ways put your eyes and fix your eyes towards Jesus. When I think about Good Friday, I think about the killing of such a good man, this man named Jesus. Who is this man Jesus? And what did he do to deserve death? I think that is one of the things that I've always pondered. And if you really look at the story throughout the Gospels, who is he really a threat to? And who really put him to death? And I think about that. I think about how such a meek and such a mild and such an incredible human being who did so many different things for so many different hurting people end up on a cross. In John's, he talks about this, that there's powerful forces and characters that are at work throughout this entire week, and it's called Holy Week or Passion Week. And the question becomes, who's in charge? And my guess is the Pharisees think they're in charge. Obviously, Pilate, the Romans, think they're in charge. They had built this huge, fortress above the Jewish temple to remind them who's in charge. They would oftentimes, what they would do is they would make the high priest, who would go in once a year to the Holy of Holies to make the sacrifice, beg them in order to put the holy vestments on for that religious ceremony. But what do they all want, and whose agenda will prevail? And it's interesting is that I appreciate the way that John talks about this because there's so many other would-be messiahs. Now, the word Messiah is the Jewish term for king, the Israel's rightful king, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. And the Christ is not Jesus' last name. That is what he is or represents based upon the Old Testament scriptures. And what you have to remember is that there was many attempts to be these so-called messiahs, too numerous to mention here. But they were always trying to rebel and just upheave the Romans. But the Romans were too strong, too much military might and power. And many, though there were some revolters, many had just basically said, as in Rome, do as in Rome. They just accommodated, they just went with the Rome system. The Herodians were like that. I think even in many ways the Pharisees became like that as well. They couldn't beat them, so they decided to join them. But anyhow, as we look back on Friday morning, after his beating, his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, and all of that, they finally present the Pharisees, that is, to this man named Pilate, after he's been beaten to a pulp, mocked, and all of that. And they asked him, what charge is there? Well, this man, they said, is somebody who is trying to oppose Caesar. He even says he's a king, which you need to understand. That's treason. That would be treason to say that. And this is kind of how the game was played, and this is how the chief priests knew they had to play the game. And they weren't really interested in Jesus necessarily. They just wanted him gone, so to speak. This Jesus, though, they kept on saying, is a problem for Rome. You better do something about it. And when Pilate finds out about Jesus, he tries to pass the buck, if you know the story, to Herod, who actually has jurisdiction over, the situation with the Pharisees. But Herod keeps kicking it back to Pilate. And so finally, basically, Pilate's like, I see nothing wrong with this man. And he tries to have Jesus talk, and Jesus doesn't talk, if you remember the story. What's interesting, though, is finally in this famous scene, Pilate washes his hands, and it's not that Pilate has a sensitive, conscience or is worried about Jesus. He knows the charge is a trumped up charge against Jesus. He really found nothing wrong with Jesus. But Pilate has bigger problems than the fate of some would-be wannabe Messiah. In Pilate's mind, had no military, no army whatsoever. And so his challenge to maintain the upper hand on the chief priest, I think, and over the temple. So he just needs to exert himself in control. And of course, they have that whole thing of, let Barabbas go versus Jesus, let Barabbas go, who was a revolutionary. And so it's interesting, a question that hung over Jesus's entire ministry was the same one at this time for that Good Friday trial. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? And if you were here last week at Eat Free, we talked a lot about that triumphant entry. I mean, that was that Palm Sunday was a military theological statement. It's not to be romanticized. It was meant to be symbolic of the rightful king coming in on a donkey, on the seat of a foal, to take back Jerusalem and take back the region, Judea, all of it from the oppressors and the Rome. And people, if you remember, I mean, they were crying, Hosanna, Hosanna, and they were shouting from the Psalms that recognized all of this. And when Jesus is finally in front of Pilate, he doesn't talk at all. And Jesus never claims the title until it's too late. And I thought a lot about that, and part of my devotion was thinking about that. Jesus knew that. Ultimately, Jesus knew that. The fact of the matter is, Jesus pronounced his own death sentence. Who caused Jesus to die? Jesus himself. Jesus himself. He understood that he could have at any moment in all of this, he could have, raised up a whole legion of angels, multiples, just destroyed any kind of puny little army. He could have actually rose up in a way of nationalism, or taking on the temple again, all of that to take over his rightful throne as the second person of the triune God from the Old Testament. He doesn't do that as well. And it's an incredible, incredible story. But Jesus outlasted, he outmaneuvered, outthought every single one of those groups who thought they were in control, who thought they were actually taking the life of Jesus. But the reality is, this is what I love, mostly John wrote that he outloved everyone. Not only did he outmaneuver them, but he outloved them. For Jesus in the garden had one agenda and one agenda alone, and that is love. And he allowed himself to die on Friday. On Friday, Jesus died for love. And he said, in reality, it was his choice. It wasn't Pilate's, it wasn't Herod's, it wasn't Caesar's, it wasn't the chief priests. He said, I lay down my life for my sheep. No one takes it from me. I lay it down on my own accord. He had the authority. Good Friday is a reminder that Jesus chose to die. He chose to die so that anyone who just believes in him just a little bit might live forever. When I think about that, I'm going to take a moment this day to just sit quietly, maybe go for a walk, and just remember how much I'm loved. And my prayer for you on this Good Friday is that you would remember this Good Friday as really not the brutality, not the crowds, the manipulation, the chanting, or Pilate or Herod, who's responsible for Jesus' death. My prayer is that you would remember that ultimately Jesus chose to die because he had you in mind, that he utterly, utterly loves you, that you are far more loved than you could ever dream or ever imagine. Love is the strongest force in this world. It's his love that hung him on that cross, and it was his love that led to the resurrection, which we celebrate in just a couple of days on Easter morning, on Easter Sunday. Be blessed. Take some time, reflect, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend. And I hope to see you maybe at EFC, 10 a.m., where you have a breakfast at 9 before that to help the kids raise some fundraising for helping to raise money for youth trips this summer. And then the service starts at 10 o'clock. I would love to see you. If not EFC, somewhere else, be blessed.